03:52 hours, December 22nd, 1944. The night over the Belgian village of Stoumont was not quiet. It was muffled. Snow did not fall. It accumulated, layer after layer, until the landscape looked less like frozen earth and more like plaster poured across hills. The sky gave no light. The only illumination came from lanterns hanging beneath tarpaulin sheets, their weak glow sinking into ruts carved by tank tracks. The ruts had frozen into jagged trenches of ice, capable of grinding steel links and seizing machinery. 2 Sherman tanks sat behind a barn whose roof sagged under the weight of wet, heavy snow. Their engines were silent, the way a corpse is silent. Each tank crew huddled inside wool coats, helmets pulled low, hands tucked into armpits. The vehicles were marked as belonging to the 740th Tank Battalion. Men called them the Orphans because their supply line had vanished sometime after dusk. For 6 hours, their fuel gauges had not moved. Not because they were steady, because there was nothing left to burn. A Sherman consumed 1 gallon every couple of minutes, even while idle. When moving at combat throttle, it could swallow more than 100 gallons in 1 hour. Without gasoline, it was a coffin disguised as armor, a cannon mounted on a tomb. Dozens of Shermans had already been abandoned during this phase of the German offensive. Crews would spike the guns, drain what little fuel remained, and set explosive charges inside the turret, so the Germans would find only twisted metal and useless machinery. The German winter offensive, the one American generals had assumed impossible, had pushed forward with a single clear tactic: starve American armor. Do not destroy tanks, do not cripple engines, simply drain the gasoline the Shermans required, and the battalion would collapse on its own. Panzer divisions cut supply roads, not battle formations. Fuel depots were targeted before headquarters. Convoy trucks vanished into snowy forests, never arriving, never reported destroyed. Inside the command post, slapped together in the barn, officers repeated the same impossible order: hold the crossroads north of Stoumont until reinforcements arrived. 6 hours. They needed 6 hours. The tanks outside might not last 6 minutes. The crews grumbled quietly. They were not angry at the enemy. They were angry at the arithmetic. No one could fight mathematics. One tanker leaned against the Sherman's cold hull and whispered like a prayer, "You can't drive on nothing." Another cursed headquarters for orders they could not obey. A third stared at the frozen ground and muttered, "We're dead the second sun comes up." Across a few dozen paces, smoke drifted from a tent pinned down by ropes and ration crates. It was the battalion's field kitchen. Inside, the heat was almost painful. Oil lamps hissed, and the smell of boiled potatoes mixed with diesel fumes used to ignite the stoves. The steam clung to the canvas roof, collecting in beads that dripped slowly onto tabletops. Staff Sergeant William "Red" Daniels stirred a pot too thick to be soup and too watery to be stew. He was 33. With hair the color of rust and a crooked nose broken sometime before the war. He did not look like a soldier. He looked like a mechanic pretending to wear a cook's apron. Most days, Daniels never carried a rifle. His tools were a 20-quart stock pot, a battered ladle, and a pair of gloves that smelled of onions. But war camps always collected stories, and Daniels had his share. Before the Army, he had worked on trucks in Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl. Families there were too poor to buy proper gasoline. Farmers mixed alcohol, kerosene, and low-grade fuel to keep exhausted machinery alive. Daniels had learned how to thin engine fuel with whatever liquid burned, and how to squeeze horsepower from engines that should have died years earlier. Moonshiners taught him how to cut homemade alcohol so tractors would run without rattling themselves apart. They joked that the only difference between fuel and liquor was taste. Daniels sniffed them both the same way. A mechanic guessed quality by smell. A cook did too. When the war came, Daniels enlisted. The army assigned him to cook because he knew how to feed men cheaply and keep things running when parts were missing. He never complained. Feeding soldiers mattered as much as fighting, and besides, he liked being near engines. The roar reminded him of those broken farm machines limping through drought-stricken fields. Tonight, Daniels listened through the kitchen tent wall. He heard tank crews arguing, heard them saying they would be captured by dawn, heard a loader whisper that he hoped the engine froze before the Germans arrived so they would not have to blow their own tank up. He kept stirring slowly, as though mixing soup were the same as mixing fuel. Outside, the snow groaned beneath the boots of a runner, bringing messages from command. Inside, Daniel's eyes drifted to a stack of metal crates beside the stove. They were stamped and labeled as burner fuel, denatured alcohol, reserved for heating, not for engines. He did not move toward them. He did not speak. But the moment he looked at the crates, his expression changed. He did not see stove fuel. He saw potential. He saw something that burned when ignited. Something that could be made thinner, thicker, hotter, colder, if someone knew how. The Sherman crews kept arguing. The officers kept pretending the fuel trucks would arrive. The cold kept tightening its grip on steel, oil, and men. Daniels listened, silent, calm, observant, as if studying a boiling pot. He understood something the tankers had not accepted yet. Fuel would not arrive. No one was coming. And a cook might be the only person left who could make a Sherman move. 0420 hours, December 22nd, 1944. The blizzard thinned enough to show faint lines of tread marks leading east, tracks from fuel trucks that never returned. Staff officers still clung to hope, but hope had no smell. Daniels trusted scent more than promises. He crouched beside the crates of stove fuel and twisted a cap off one can. Fumes rose sharp and biting, strong enough to numb his nostrils. High-proof denatured alcohol. Flammable, fast-burning, too fast if used wrong. He dipped one finger in, rubbed it between thumb and forefinger. Thin, volatile. It would evaporate in the cold unless thickened or mixed. On a stove, speed was good. In an engine, speed was death. Radial engines needed slow detonations, measured explosions in chambers timed to fractions of a second. Too violent, and a piston cracked. Too weak, and a motor stalled. Sherman engines weren't temperamental because they were weak. They were temperamental because they were aircraft engines jammed into tanks. A Sherman's power plant was a radial design originally built for planes. Air-cooled, multi-cylinder, and hungry. It wanted fuel with the right vapor pressure, the right ignition timing. Something that wouldn't shock the pistons. Something that wouldn't detonate too soon. The quartermaster stomped into the tent, boots shedding slush. Lieutenant Warren, tall, cold, and exhausted. "Daniels," he snapped. "Command wants coffee ready by sunrise. No delays." "Yes, sir," Daniels answered without looking up from the burner fuel. Warren frowned at the open crate. "That's combustion alcohol. Keep it sealed. We need it for the stoves tonight." Daniels nodded slowly. "We need the tanks more." Warren ignored that. Officers rarely heard what enlisted men understood. He turned to leave, muttering, "Fuel trucks'll make it. They have to." Daniels did not argue. He had spent enough years watching men pray to impossible outcomes. Oklahomans prayed for rain that never came, just like tank crews prayed for gasoline that could not arrive. He went back to stirring breakfast, but his mind wasn't in the pot. It was in an engine block, picturing pistons, spark timing, vapor density. He remembered a bootlegger named Clyde who ran a truck on Liquor Cut with turpentine. Clyde used a wooden dowel to measure viscosity. Daniel still remembered the motions. Dip, drip, sniff, adjust. Fuel was cooking. Cooking was fuel. At 05:10 hours, a tanker stumbled into the tent. Frost clung to his eyebrows. His name patch read, Jacobs, a loader from Bravo Company. He slammed his gloves on a table and hissed through chattering teeth. "We just got orders to hold that crossroads until mid-afternoon. Command says resupply is incoming." Daniels ladled thin stew into a tin bowl. "Do you believe that?" Jacobs stared at the bowl. "I believe I don't want to blow up my tank." "Then don't sit still," Daniels muttered. Jacobs looked up. "You got gasoline hiding in here somewhere, Cook?" Daniels tapped the crates. "Not cement, gasoline. Something that burns." Jacobs scoffed. "You gonna feed the tank soup too?" Daniels didn't smile. "Engines eat, just like us. Wrong food kills them. Right mix keeps them going." Jacob stopped laughing. Daniels placed the bowl in front of him, not as comfort food, as a warning. If something burns, it can power a machine, but it needs balance. "Balance of what?" Jacobs asked. "Explosive force," Daniels said. "Too fast and the engine shatters. Too slow and it starves." Jacobs whispered, "You're serious?" Daniels finally allowed himself one brief grin. "Oklahoma didn't have fuel depots. We had moonshiners." For the first time, the loader stared at the cook the way men stare at ordnance experts, not as a servant, but as someone who knows dangerous materials. Jacob spoke quietly. "If you could make something, would it work?" Daniels shrugged. "Never tried it on a tank, only tractors and trucks. And a tractor doesn't have a 75mm cannon strapped to it." "Could it blow the engine?" Daniels stirred the pot again, slow, methodical. "If I'm wrong, it'll crack the cylinders. You'll be stuck inside a steel box when the Germans show up." Jacob swallowed hard. Better than being stuck without burning anything at all. Daniels nodded once, not in agreement, but in understanding. It was the same calculation farmers made when feeding sick horses food they weren't meant to eat. Risk the new diet, or let the animal die anyway. Outside, engines from idle Shermans coughed as crews tested batteries in the freezing dark. Coughs turned to silence. Silence turned to dread. 0600 hours approached. Officers began preparing patrol plans that required machines that could not move. Radio men whispered about incoming German armor. The crossroads north of Stomont would be hit soon, maybe before sunrise. In the kitchen tent, Daniels cleaned a mess spoon with alcohol and wiped frost from a steel cup. Measurements mattered now. Ratios mattered. 11 minutes of warming, he would say later. But at this moment, he simply touched the stove flame and watched how fast the burner fuel evaporated. He didn't see a kitchen anymore. He saw a workshop built from soup pots and desperation. And the cook began planning how to feed an engine. 0620 hours, December 22nd, 1944. The sky had begun to pale to a shade between slate and ash. Dawn didn't break in Ardennes winter. It crept in reluctantly, as though afraid of what it might reveal. Far off, shots cracked across the valley, not engagements yet, just nervous patrols firing at shadows. Every sound echoed too long in the cold. Metal did not only freeze, it amplified. Inside the kitchen tent, Daniels laid out a strange array on the table. A mess spoon, 2 tin cups, a length of rag, and a cut jerry can nozzle he snagged from a maintenance cart before anyone noticed. He worked fast, not frenzied, with the patience of someone who had improvised survival before. Men from the outside would look at him and see a cook messing with burner fuel. But what he saw in front of him was not a meal. The ingredients were explosives. The first Sherman engines of Bravo Company coughed again. The sound vibrated through the snow. Dead batteries strained to turn, stuttered, then fell silent. A tanker cursed loud enough to rattle the tent flap. Daniels poured a small amount of gasoline into one tin cup and half-filled the other with denatured stove alcohol. He sniffed both, then mixed a few drops together. His face tightened. Too thin, too aggressive. It would ignite too quickly. He needed to slow the burn as it vaporized. He reached for a crate under the stove and pulled out a dented can marked industrial solvent for cleaning machinery. It wasn't fuel, not in the official sense. But it had weight, viscosity, just enough to soften the violence of alcohol combustion. He whispered to himself, the way cooks mutter when measuring spices. 1 part gasoline, 2 parts burner fuel, 1 part solvent. He didn't need to write it down. He had already scratched it into the frost earlier, and that was enough. Footsteps stomped outside. Lieutenant Warren shoved the tent flap open again. His face was tight with exhaustion, his voice clipped. "Daniels, we're rationing alcohol for heating. Command wants burners running all day. You don't touch those crates without authorization." Daniels didn't look up. "Then tell command to heat the tanks instead. They're colder than we are." Warren clenched his jaw. "That's not your concern." Daniels finally met his eyes. "Cold engines don't run." Warren stared back, realizing maybe for the first time that the cook was not discussing breakfast. Before he could respond, a captain strode into view outside, barking orders about roadblocks and fallback points. Warren snapped to attention and left, leaving steam and argument behind him. Daniels didn't wait for permission. He dipped the mess spoon into the alcohol, gauging rate of drip. He tilted it over the gasoline mix and watched how quickly the vapor rose. Too fast. He needed viscosity thickened. He tore a rag, dipped one corner into the solvent, wrung it tightly, and let a thread-thin strand fall into the mix. The drip slowed the vapor rise by just enough. Then came the final test. He touched a matchstick to the mixture. It caught fire, but not violently. A flame, steady and blue, burned with purpose, not rage. He nodded once. He could feed a Sherman this. Maybe. 0650 hours. A rumble outside signaled a half-track rolling past the barn ruins. Its engine sputtered in the cold, then surged to life. That sound triggered something in Daniels. Memory. Hot Oklahoma sun on a broken truck, sweat mixing with gasoline fumes. A farmer pleading for help because his engine had seized during harvest. Daniels crafting crude blends with moonshiner alcohol to keep grain haulers alive through dust storms. He remembered the way one farmer had said, "She'll break if she doesn't move, and she'll break if she does. Pick your poison." That same choice stood outside the tent, facing steel monsters instead of tractors. Jacobs returned, dragging his tank commander with him. Sergeant Cole, broad-shouldered and stiff with fatigue. Cole held out a cup of black coffee. "Red, is it true you used alcohol to keep engines alive?" he asked quietly. Daniels sipped the coffee slowly. "Used to run half of Oklahoma on bad liquor." Cole rubbed his beard. "If you can make a Sherman move 20 miles, we can grab fuel on the other side. Command thinks trucks are stuck behind German lines." Daniels didn't blink. "I'm not promising 20 miles. I'm promising motion." Cole nodded. "Motion's more than we got." Daniels wiped his hands on his apron. "You'll need to idle 11 minutes. No less, no more. Let the cylinders adjust to the burn." Cole frowned. 11 minutes exactly? Why? Daniels looked at him with the patience of a teacher explaining fire to a child. Engines need time to understand what they're drinking. Too cold and it knocks. Too hot and it detonates. Cole muttered, "Sounds like cooking." Daniels responded, "Engines eat." At 0710 hours, he carried the first crude fuel mixture outside in steel pots normally reserved for stew. Crewmen stared at him like he lost his mind. "What are you feeding her, cook?" one gunner asked. Daniels set the pot down beside the fuel port and answered flatly, "Breakfast." He sliced the spout from the cut jerry can, wedged it into the filler neck, and poured the shimmering mixture into the tank. The fluid smelled sharp enough to sting eyes, yet not harsh enough to scream explosion. Controlled violence. He slapped the hull twice. "Warm her. 11 minutes. Don't rev her." The crew followed orders more out of desperation than belief. The engine turned once, twice, then caught. A roar, uneven, weak, shivering through cylinders. Daniels closed his eyes, listening. Not to the noise, to the timing. He counted breaths. 1 minute, 2, 3. At minute 11, the engine settled, deepened, found rhythm. Cole looked at him. "Is it safe?" Daniels shook his head. "No, but it's alive." The second Sherman roared next, not strong, but awake. They were no longer coffins. They were predators in hunger. Dawn spread across frozen fields. Panzers would come soon. The cook's concoction was not fuel. It was a gamble. But it was a gamble that burned, and 2 Shermans were ready to drive behind enemy lines. 0738 hours, December 22nd, 1944. The 2 Sherman tanks idled behind the frozen barn like beasts waking from hibernation. Their exhaust sputtered white plumes into the air, thicker than the breath of their crews. Men gathered around them, hands jammed into pockets, watching as though witnessing surgery. No one spoke loudly. Loud voices could break hope. Sergeant Cole climbed onto the lead Sherman, pawed frost off the periscope, and shouted a short command. "Mount up!" The tank crew scrambled inside, boots clanging against chilled steel. Daniels watched from the ground, wiping his hands on his apron, even though no food stains were there, only solvent and burner fuel. Lieutenant Warren finally returned, noticing the engines running. "Who authorized this?" he barked. Cole didn't answer. Daniels did. "Nobody authorized starving." Warren's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, but the tanks were alive, and nobody argues with life in a battlefield defined by death. He stepped back, arms crossed, saying nothing. Cole gestured to Daniels. "You riding with us?" Daniels shook his head. "I'm a cook. I feed engines, not fire guns." Cole grunted. "Then stay near the stove. We may need more of your recipe." Daniels watched as the crew sealed the hatches. The tanks were now sealed metal coffins or sealed metal miracles. Either outcome belonged to the next few hours. The order came over field radio. Break through enemy screen to the east. Link with supply element. Avoid engagement if possible. Tankers laughed bitterly at the last sentence. Avoiding engagement was something infantry did in textbooks. Shermans did not avoid. Shermans attracted bullets the way barns attracted snow. Cole revved gently, letting the engine feel its own breathe. The improvised fuel mixture screamed slightly, like a drunken stallion trying to remember how to gallop. Then the tank lurched forward. Tracks bit ice. Metal growled. The second Sherman followed, its driver cautious but steady. The column consisted of 2 tanks and a single half-track escort, loaded with wounded and spare parts. They moved out of the farmyard, engines rumbling through snow-compacted roads that had claimed countless vehicles days earlier. They cleared the barn, they cleared the trees. No enemy fire, not yet. 0814 hours. The tanks reached a narrow road bordered by pine groves. The improvised fuel burned hotter now. The engines ran a bit too lean at cold RPM, causing a hiccup every few hundred yards. Daniels rode behind in a maintenance jeep, listening to every sputter with the anxiety of a parent watching a fevered child. He heard every misfire as though it echoed inside his skull. He leaned forward and yelled to the driver, "If they idle too long, they'll choke. Keep them moving slower uphill, faster on flat ground." The driver nodded, not understanding the chemistry, but trusting the tone. Ahead, the lead Sherman slowed. A crossroads was visible. Just a muddy, frozen intersection that connected nothing to nowhere. But cautiously, Cole swerved and kept rolling east, deeper into territory where German patrols roamed. A corporal in the jeep muttered, "We're 60 miles from fuel, we're lucky. And we're driving toward the enemy to get it." Daniels replied without looking at him, "Fuel doesn't come to tanks. Tanks go to fuel." No one argued. They kept moving. 0852 hours. The column reached a low ridge. Tracks cracked thin ice beneath them. Gunfire echoed faintly to the south, rapid, desperate. Someone else's battle. Cole raised binoculars through the hatch. His voice came over the radio. "Panzer tracks, multiple sets. They passed through here this morning." The tension in the half-track grew thick. If German armor returned, the two Shermans would be shredded within minutes. Improvised fuel did not change armor thickness. It didn't improve the weak side plating. It only provided motion. Motion was not victory. It was survival. The tanks crossed the ridge, descended the other side. The radios crackled. Friendly infantry reported a destroyed fuel convoy near the village of Chenu. Dozens of fuel trucks were either captured or burning. But scattered among them were drums that had not ignited, untouched, possibly intact, possibly full. Daniels exhaled slowly. Not relief. Calculation. Alcohol blend could get them there. Thickened gasoline could get them out. Everything depended on getting those drums. 0934 hours. The tanks approached Chenu from the north. Smoke smothered the air in oily curtains. Black snowflakes, bits of burned rubber and insulation, fell lightly onto the Sherman hulls. The village was crushed, roofs caved in, wagons overturned. A fuel truck lay on its side, wheels still turning slightly, creaking like a dying horse. Cole halted the column behind an overturned hay cart. They waited, listened. Nothing but the crackle of burning wood. No engines, no German voices, no shouted orders. Daniel stepped out of the jeep. He moved carefully to a ruptured drum near the truck. His boots slid on frozen diesel. He pressed his gloved hand to another barrel, icy but intact. He banged the side. The hollow thud confirmed it wasn't empty. He shouted to Cole, "This one's full." Cole replied, "Pull the drums, fast." Crewmen scrambled to load what they could. Daniels inspected each drum like a doctor checking a patient's pulse. He smelled vents for contamination. He checked seams for water infiltration. Frostbite stung his fingers when he removed gloves to feel viscosity. He was not fueling tanks now. He was choosing which drums would let them live. The improvised mixture burned through about a quarter of the tank's capacity during the journey. Now they needed enough proper fuel to dilute it, blend it, so the engines wouldn't melt themselves on the return. They didn't need full tanks. They needed just enough. Enough to fight fate. As they loaded the last drum, the half-track driver whispered, "What if they come back? The panzers who did this." Daniels tightened the cap on a drum. "Then we don't stay long enough to meet them." Cole slammed them. Sherman hatch shut. "Mount up." We're not rescuing barrels. We're stealing away home. Two Shermans growled again, fueled partly by stolen gasoline, partly by a cook's reckless alchemy. The return journey would be harder, because the enemy now owned the roads they had just crossed, and improvised miracles burn only for so long. 10:20 hours, December 22nd, 1944. The two Shermans rolled out of the ruined village of Cheneux with fuel drums chained to their rear hull racks and crewmen clinging to the side grab rails. The improvised mix still burned hot through the engines, and now they carried proper gasoline as well, enough to dilute it and stabilize the combustion once they stopped moving. But they were still deep inside an area the Germans believed they controlled. The roads ahead were no longer empty. German patrols would be shifting through crossroads, checking for surviving supply trucks, salvaging whatever usable fuel remained. The 8-man half-track escort crept farther behind, its driver glancing left and right every few seconds, as though expecting a panzer to materialize out of the trees. Daniels rode in that half-track, sitting on top of a fuel drum instead of on the bench. His gloved fingers traced the cold metal surface. He wasn't trying to check it anymore. He was trying to remember it, the way a chef memorizes flavor. So if everything goes wrong, he knows how to replicate it again. He hadn't written the ratios on paper. He had committed them to instinct. Ahead, Sergeant Cole's Sherman slowed at a fork. His voice crackled over radio. "South Road is shorter. North Road is safer. What's your call?" The voice of a lieutenant at Battalion HQ tried to respond through static, offering orders as if distance could see danger. "Proceed south and—" The radio died, swallowed by snow static. Cole exhaled. The choice was no longer about command. It was about survival. Daniels leaned forward and shouted toward the Jeep driver. "North Road. South brings us closer to the ridge where panzers crossed. Their scouts will still be nearby." The Jeep sergeant frowned. "You a tactician now, Cook?" Daniels replied, "I'm a man who doesn't want to meet a tank today." The decision rippled through the column. Cole's tank eased left, taking the longer northern road winding through pine stands that grew so close together they scraped paint from the Sherman hulls. 1100 hours. Wind funneled through the trees, carrying the smell of pine sap, diesel fumes, and distant cordite. Every kilometer stretched tension thinner. The improvised fuel exhausted itself more cleanly now that proper gasoline was swirling through the system in partial dilution. The engines growled lower, steadier, as if understanding the meal they were being fed. Then came the sound no tanker wanted to hear. Metal tracks far ahead. Cole braked. Snowflakes and exhaust merged in the thin air. Everyone froze. No gunfire followed. No shouted German commands. Just slow, steady track clank. Daniels whispered, "Engine heavy. That's armor, not a half-track." The half-track gunner asked softly, "One tank or more?" Daniels closed his eyes and listened. He didn't follow notes or tactics, only rhythm. One, maybe damaged, running sloppy. Cole made a call that would never appear in official doctrine. He didn't withdraw. He didn't engage. He advanced, slowly, angled behind the crest, engine barely above idle. His reasoning was simple. A single damaged tank is either a threat that can retreat or a prize that can burn them. A quiet Sherman has a chance. A retreating one has none. As the lead Sherman crested the hill, the gunner reported quietly, "Panzer IV, disabled. Crew's gone." Charred black marks surrounded the hull. It had been ambushed earlier by American paratroopers. The tank still smoked faintly, its tracks broken, engine cooked. The Germans had abandoned it rather than risk recovery. They weren't scavenging here. They were rushing forward, trying to break further west. That meant the road behind was less guarded than the road ahead. Cole muttered into radio, "We're walking backwards through their footprints." Daniels nodded, though no one saw him. The Germans weren't stopping to hold territory. They were sprinting to choke the Allied fuel supply deeper west. That left gaps. Dangerous gaps. But gaps. 11:45 hours. They reached a bend where trees ended abruptly and opened into a small frozen pasture. The second Sherman lost traction briefly. Its tracks spun, churning the ice. The engine hiccuped. Daniels lunged forward, hollering, "Don't let it idle too long or it'll choke." Cole relayed instantly, "Push through! Don't stop!" The driver gunned it gently, and the tank lurched forward. A few more seconds of idle, and the alcohol might have separated from the fuel layer inside the carburetor, starving the cylinders. Daniels breathed out slowly. Improvisation was not a tactic. It was a tightrope. 12:10 hours. They finally intersected a road crawling with frostbitten American infantry limping westward. Figures waved frantically at the Shermans as if hallucinating salvation. One shouted, "You got fuel? How the hell are you still running?" Daniels leaned out of the half-track. "Stove burners and garbage solvent." The infantryman stared. Then he laughed, a loud, exhausted, disbelieving laugh. "Well, tell God to make more cooks then." Cole's tank didn't stop for applause. They continued west, crossing lines where the front was collapsing and reforming in real time. As they passed groups of Americans moving by foot, rumors traveled faster than the tanks themselves. Cooks running tanks. Shermans on moonshine. Fuel witches from Oklahoma. By 1300 hours, the two improvised fueled Shermans had covered more miles behind enemy movement than any unit in the area believed possible. Not because they were fast, because they refused to stop. Speed did not save them. Motion did. A tank that doesn't stop is a tank that doesn't die. They would reach their own lines soon, but their engines were not yet safe. Daniels knew something others didn't. The improvised blend must be bled out and replaced, slowly, carefully, before the radial engines tore themselves apart from internal shock. A miracle could get a tank home, but a miracle with no follow-through could still destroy it. The cook had fed the engines. Now he had to teach them how to digest. 1340 hours, December 22nd, 1944. The two Shermans rolled past a line of American engineers, clearing a wrecked truck from the roadside. The soldiers watched the tanks go by with disbelief so visible, it didn't need words. No Shermans should have been moving this deep into territory the Germans had just seized and then abandoned on their way west. No Shermans should have had fuel. Yet these two clattered forward, engines rumbling with an off-kilter rhythm that sounded more like a drunk mule than a war machine. Cole's tank stopped only when they reached a sheltered depression near a frozen river bend. Not because they were safe, but because the engines could not go 1 meter farther without risking self-destruction. The improvised fuel had done its job. Now it threatened to undo everything. The radial engines had been burning too hot, detonating unevenly, and had gone nearly 20 miles without a proper rest cycle. The tank crews climbed out, some limping from cold, cramped muscles, others shaking hands to bring warmth back into numb fingers. Daniels climbed down from the half-track, eyes not on the battlefield horizon, not on the infantry passing through, but on the smoke from the tank exhaust. He listened the way a doctor listens to breathing. Short bursts, uneven pulses, combustion sputtering in forced rhythm. The engines weren't dying. They were confused. They had been fed a meal no manual had predicted, and now they needed a different meal, given slowly, carefully, or they would choke. Cole walked over. "How far do you think we can push?" 10 more miles? Daniels shook his head. Push now, and we'll crack pistons. Melt valves. You'll end up with a sculpture, not a tank. Cole fished a cigarette from his jacket. His hands shook too badly to light it. Daniels took the match and lit it for him. Cole inhaled, then exhaled white smoke in despair. Then what do we do? Daniels pointed to the fuel drums on the racks. We dilute. Slow. The way you mix a stew that's too salty. A loader from the 2nd Sherman frowned. Engines don't eat soup, Cook. Daniels replied. Everything eats. It's how you feed it that decides if it lives. They went to work. 4 men pulled drums off the racks, their gloves slipping on frosted metal. Daniels checked each drum again, tapping the sides to hear if water had seeped in. He pried open the caps and sniffed fumes sharply. Good gasoline. The real stuff. The cure. He instructed the crews with clipped precision. 1/4 pure gas to what's already in there. Not more, not less. Stir it with an airline. Don't pump it. Shake it gently, like you're waking somebody up, not slapping them. One tanker blinked. Stir with what airline? Daniels pointed at the half-track's air hose. That one. 18 seconds, no longer. A corporal scoffed. How do you know 18 seconds? Daniels looked up. Because 17 makes lumps and 19 makes foam. You foam fuel, you suck air, and die on the road. No one laughed again. The crews followed instructions exactly, partly out of trust, partly out of fear of what would happen if they didn't. Daniels climbed onto the lead Sherman, kneeling beside the filler port, watching the mixture bubble and settle like a simmering pot. He spoke quietly, almost reverently. 11 minutes again. The crews nodded. They didn't ask why. They just set the chronometers on their wristwatches, counting seconds of combustion breath, just like he had taught them before dawn. 0 rest, 0 breaks. 11 minutes of idle heat to teach the engines how to burn their new meal. At minute 5, the engine sputtered like it wanted to die. The gunner tensed as though shot at. Daniels held up one finger. Wait. At minute 9, a soft whine rose from the cylinders, thin and dangerous. Daniels placed his bare hand on the hull. He winced as it warmed fast, too fast. But he held his hand there, reading temperature by touch, not gauge. At minute 11, he signaled with 2 taps on the metal. Kill idle. Test throttle. The driver depressed the pedal gently. The radial engine roared, but deep this time. Balanced, tamed. They repeated the process on the 2nd tank. 11 minutes, 2 taps, 1 slow throttle. Both engines settled into a sound they hadn't made all day, not a drunken gallop, but a growling march. Infantry passing by slowed to stare. One shouted, "You boys fixing tanks with cooking lessons." Daniels wiped his hands on his apron. Engines and men break the same way. Feed 'em wrong and they stop fighting. Feed 'em right and they'll go farther than they should. The infantrymen laughed. Then keep feeding 'em. Daniels didn't smile. He looked at the tanks, newly balanced on their stolen fuel, and whispered not to the men, but to the machines themselves. Don't quit now. Because they were not done. The Shermans were alive, but they were still trapped in a landscape ruled by enemy armor. And a tank that runs too well becomes a target again. 16:15 hours, December 22nd, 1944. Dusk arrived early in the Ardennes. The sky dimmed into a violet haze, and the tree line ahead became a jagged silhouette. Snow pressed down like wet wool. It muffled footsteps. It muted artillery. It swallowed engines unless those engines roared at full throttle. The two Shermans rolled out of the river bend and onto a narrow logging road, cut through the forest. They moved at 12 miles per hour, the fastest they dared without risking fuel shock. Infantry from the 31st Tank Destroyer Group marched behind them, rifles slung, boots sinking into the white crust. The improvised convoy had no map route beyond one objective: reach a friendly fuel dump somewhere west of Spa. 60 miles of territory shifted by the hour. Patrol lines changed faster than orders. Survival depended on luck, steel, and one cook's recipe. The first German contact came 7 miles later. A burned-out car sat across the road, its chassis blackened, wheels missing. Cole slowed his tank, thinking it was debris from a retreat. Daniels shouted from the half-track, "Don't stop! It's bait!" Cole gunned the throttle. As soon as the Sherman passed the wreck, a burst of rifle fire erupted from a ditch to the right. 2 German soldiers popped up with Panzerfausts on their shoulders. The Sherman gunner did not wait for orders. The tank's 50 caliber machine gun spat 10 rounds. Snow erupted in clots. The 2 Germans fell before they fired. Cole keyed the intercom. "Eyes open. They're hunting stalled armor. We stop, we die." The road curved uphill. The engines strained unevenly, still learning how to digest their strange meal. Daniels leaned out of the half-track, listening again, reading the sound behind the roar. The engines protested on the incline, popping, coughing, but they did not stall. The Sherman radial motors were stubborn like the men who drove them. 29 infantrymen marched with the tanks. They depended on those machines for cover. Without armor, they would be nothing but meat on a frozen road. Without fuel, the armor would be nothing but targets. At 19 miles, the snow thickened and hid the tracks of other vehicles. The convoy encountered a destroyed American Jeep in a ditch. Frozen bodies lay beside it, covered in ice like statues. One infantryman crossed himself. Another muttered, "They must have run dry." Daniels stared at the Jeep's frozen fuel tank. Empty. He knew what it meant. German strategy was working. Tanks didn't need to be destroyed. They just needed to starve. The improvised fuel mix made the Shermans unpredictable, but it made them unpredictable in the one direction that mattered: forward. At mile 22, the convoy reached a fork in the road. The signpost had been torn off. Cole looked to Daniels. "Left or right?" Daniels knelt, scooped snow from the roadside, and rubbed it between his fingers. Then he sniffed it. The infantry stared at him like he'd gone mad. Cole waited. Daniels pointed left. "Smells like exhaust. Something big passed through there recently. Tanks or trucks. If they went left, they're going somewhere worth going." Cole didn't question it. They turned left. 2 miles later, they found tracks. Heavy tread prints, American pattern, heading west. The convoy followed. As darkness fell, German searchlights swept across distant hills. The tanks powered on with their strange hearts, burning a mixture no Allied manual would approve. The alcohol fuel thinned in the cold, feeding the engines faster when they least needed it, threatening to burn too hot and blow a cylinder. Daniels rode with his hand near the throttles of the half-track, like a man watching over boiling soup. At mile 31, they heard German engines ahead. Cole whispered into the radio, "Sound off." The infantry took cover behind trees. The tanks powered down to idle. A column of half-tracks and trucks moved across the road perpendicular to them. Lights dimmed, engines groaning under heavy diesel loads. A German convoy, transporting ammunition. If the Shermans had roared 1 second earlier, the enemy would have found them. Daniels didn't breathe until the sound faded into the forest. Cole whispered, "We can't fight them. Not with this fuel. One direct hit, and we're torches. Daniels nodded. Then we keep moving, quiet as we can, and slow. 5 more miles, then 10. The improvised mix burned faster now that the alcohol evaporated quicker under cold night air. They would run dry before morning. Daniels recalculated ratios in his mind, like a man adjusting seasoning in a pot that kept boiling away too fast. At mile 47, they spotted an American roadblock, a pile of logs, and 2 nervous riflemen who almost shot them thinking they were captured tanks. One soldier yelled, "Where the hell did you come from? We have no armor left in this sector." Cole simply pointed behind him. "We brought ours." Daniels didn't speak. He was counting again, mentally tasting fumes, feeling how much fire the engines had left. 20 gallons? 12? Less? They pushed forward. At mile 56, the Shermans began to cough again. Daniels leaned close to the hull. "Come on, stay with me." At mile 59, the engines sounded like hammers hitting metal drums. The tanks shook like living animals pushing past exhaustion. At mile 61, a fuel depot came into view. Barrels stacked behind snow rows, guarded by men who thought reinforcements were impossible. Cole radioed Daniels. "We actually made it." Daniels exhaled. "We fed them right." And the Shermans rolled in, alive on borrowed fire. 0530 hours, December 23rd, 1944. The sky over the depot glowed a faint silver before dawn. Frost clung to fuel lines like powder sugar over black hoses. Snow crusted onto the stacked barrels, frozen into thick collars around their steel rims. The Shermans rested at idle on the far end of the barricade. Their engines throbbed in exhausted rhythm, like hearts that had sprinted too far, but refused to stop. Tank crews slept where they collapsed. Inside turrets, on engine decks, under tracks still warm from the night drive. Infantry lay in piles of blankets against sandbags, snoring like men who had outrun death by inches. The depot guards kept staring at the Shermans, shaking their heads as if seeing ghosts. Armor wasn't supposed to come from the east. Not in Ardennes, not that night, not alive. Cole climbed out of his turret, stretching his back. He walked to the half-track where Daniels sat beside the engine block, soaking heat into his hands. Daniels looked like he'd aged 10 years in one night. His face was ash gray, his hair stiff with ice. Cole crouched beside him. "You're not even crew," Cole said quietly. Daniels shrugged. "Last night, I was the only thing standing between you and walking home." "Last night," Cole replied, "you were the battalion." Fuel officers emerged from the depot office, led by a captain with red cheeks and a clipboard tucked under his arm. He wore clean gloves, unlike everyone else. He looked at the Shermans, looked at Daniel's battered mixing pots stacked like abandoned cookware, and frowned with confused disgust. "Who authorized this fuel?" he asked. Cole pointed at Daniels. Daniels didn't move. He said, "It worked. That's the authorization." The captain shook his head. "Sherman engines are rated for 80 octane. Not that," he gestured toward the pots, "that kitchen witchcraft." Daniels replied without looking up. "Kitchen witchcraft kept your depot from getting flattened by panzers yesterday." The captain opened his mouth, closed it, and changed tactics. "Do you understand the damage you might have done? Cylinder scoring, valve knock, burned pistons?" Daniels interrupted with a single sentence. "Better a burned piston than a frozen grave." Silence followed. The guards looked at the cook. The captain looked at the tanks. Nobody argued further. By 0600, fuel crews began pumping proper gasoline into the Shermans. Daniels watched the rich amber liquid fill the tanks and sniffed the fumes like a man judging whether the soup stock had gone sour. His improvised brew was spent. The cold pots sat empty, rimmed with brown-black residue. They smelled like chemicals, stale fire, and victory. Cole asked him quietly, "Could you make it again, if you had to?" Daniels wiped the rim of one pot with his thumb. "Not exactly. Ratios change with weather, changes with engine wear, changes with how scared the man holding the ladle is." Cole blinked. "You're telling me the recipe depends on fear?" Daniels shrugged. "Everything depends on fear. Fear decides how much gamble you pour into the mix." Before Cole could respond, a jeep slid into the depot yard. A major climbed out, coat flapping in the wind, goggles still on, as though he'd driven straight from the front. He demanded, "Who's responsible for the East Road armor movement?" Guards pointed at Daniels and Cole. The major studied the two Shermans, still, steaming in the cold. "We've been hearing rumors. Tanks coming from behind German lines." No one believed it. He turned to Daniels. "What kept those engines running?" Daniels opened his mouth to speak. Cole cut in. "Fuel improvisation, authorized under emergency operations." The major narrowed his eyes. "Show me the authorization." Daniels tapped his chest with his thumb. "Right here, signed by necessity." The major almost smiled. Almost. Then he nodded. "Front command wants a briefing. They want to know how you ran 60 miles without proper fuel. You'll document procedures immediately." Daniels looked at the pots. "I don't have procedures. I have instincts," the major replied. "Instinct just outran a panzer division. Write it down." At 0730, in a makeshift office beside the depot, Daniels sat with a pencil, staring at a blank ledger page. He wrote slowly, in block letters. He listed ratios the best he could remember. Not exact, not perfect, just possible. He included a note: "Heat mixture only until it thins enough to pour. Do not overboil. Alcohol burns faster than gasoline. Compensate with idle warm-up of 11 minutes. An officer asked, "Why 11? Daniels answered, "10 isn't enough. 12 invites flame." There was no science in the explanation. Only experienced miners, farmers, moonshiners, and engine men understood. By midday, radios crackled with orders. The Shermans would roll out again. Fresh crews needed armor along the northern corridor. Fuel officers filled tanks not just with gasoline, but with interest. They wanted to see the miracle repeated. They wanted a cook's gamble to become doctrine. Daniels stood in the snow, watching the crew mount up. One tanker saluted him. Another tossed him a pair of wool gloves. A third shouted, "Come ride with us again, Red." Daniels shook his head. "I'm not crew." Cole leaned out of his turret. Last night, there was no crew. There was only who refused to quit. Daniels smirked. "Well, I refuse to quit. From the kitchen." The tank engines roared to life, burning proper fuel this time, smoother and steadier, but somehow less triumphant. They moved out in a line, steel beasts marching to another part of the war. Only Daniels stayed behind, standing in a snow-choked yard, holding a pencil smudged with fuel stains. He had no medal, no rank of consequence, no uniform story worth telling on paper. But on that frozen night, when steel should have stopped, he had fed the tanks. He had cooked for engines the way he cooked for men, improvising, adjusting, feeding them enough to keep them alive. History would never call him a tanker, but history would roll on tracks he kept moving.